Good afternoon and welcome to the LSE South Asia Centre. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I am the Deputy Director here at the LSE South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics. I am very, very happy to welcome all of you this afternoon in London, to the last event of this academic term in our series Fact and Fiction, which has been an extremely popular series that we started in Michaelmas term in 2020, where we look at one recently published book and have a discussion around that book and the issues that come out of that book, both related directly to the book and those that are related but may not be directly addressed. And I am extremely happy to say that this afternoon's discussion is around a book published last year in 2020 by Sumathi Ramaswamy called Gandhi in the Gallery, The Art of Disobedience. And Sumathi is joining us this afternoon for it, along with three eminent panelists, whom I will introduce shortly. But before that, I do want to also welcome our online audience. Some of you have been waiting. I was looking at the YouTube channel and about 30 of you were waiting for this to start. Thank you very much for waiting. And before we start with the event, there's just a few announcements that I'd like to make. As all of you know, that this event is being live streamed on YouTube, and a recording of the event will be available from tomorrow on our website in the events archive. The chat function for the event has now been enabled, and you are welcome to pose questions and ask questions during the course of the event. Once the discussions begin, whenever you like to, you're welcome to pose a question to a particular speaker, in which case, please do mention who the question is for. You're also welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. In line with LSE regulations, where had this event been on site, audience members would have had the right to not reveal their identity while asking a question. When we pose the questions to the members of the panel, I will not be announcing the names of who has asked this question. Also, the reason we ask you to pose these questions in the chat function is that once the event is over and we hold the recording, the chat function will automatically erase all the discussions and the questions. So there will be no record of the names of people who have asked. However, it is obviously so that in the course of the event, everyone can see that you are asking who is asking which question. Those of you who tweet and would like to live tweet, please do tag us at South Asia LSE, which is our Twitter handle, and it'll be great and we'll be able to retweet it, though that will only happen after the event is over. On the upside of having an online event is that we are able to bring together a panel like the one we have this afternoon, where being at the London School of Economics here in London, I can tell you that for the participants, I'm the only one who's in London. So this has been the upside in the last year of being able to do these online events. Two of our panelists are in Germany, one is in India, and one is in the United States. So this is a real privilege for us. It is now my very pleasant duty to introduce each of the speakers to you. I will introduce them once now, and I will also introduce them for the benefit of those who may come later, once before they start to speak. Anselm Franke, who will be moderating the discussion today, completed his PhD titled The Third House, The Language of Essay Exhibition from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London, and is currently Head of Visual Arts and Film at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, that is the HKW as it is more popularly known, in Berlin, where he has been since 2013. Anselm, welcome. Monica Juneja is Professor of Global Art History at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies, Asia and Europe at the University of Heidelberg, and her forthcoming book, to be published later this year, is titled Can Art History Be Made Global? Meditations from the Periphery. Monica, welcome. Sumathi Ramaswamy is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of History at Duke University and is the author of the book around which the discussion this afternoon is organized, Gandhi in the Gallery, The Art of Disobedience. Sumathi, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this. And finally, Tridip Suhrud is Provost of CEPT University in Ahmedabad, where he's also Professor and Director of the CEPT Archives. Tridip is the author of the globally acclaimed critical edition of Gandhis and Autobiography, or The Story of My Experiments with Truth, which is introduced and annotated by him. We have agreed in advance of the start of this discussion that the way in which we will proceed is that I will first invite Sumathi to make a 10-minute presentation about her book and issues related to that she may want to highlight. And once Sumathi's introduction of about 10 minutes is over, then we will invite first Tridip and then Monica to make their comments, after which Anselm will start the discussion. So Sumathi, if you would please begin, and you have about 10 minutes. I should mention here that Sumathi has a PowerPoint presentation for the benefit of those who are watching on YouTube. And the advantage of doing this is that for those of you who may not have read the book as yet, it'll give you a very good idea of what the book is about. Sumathi, please start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilanjan, for both initiating this event and for organizing the panel. I offer a very special thanks to my fellow panelists for their time and thoughts, especially in these tough times when there is so much suffering and anguish unfolding in and across India, where we have family, friends, colleagues, and other loved ones who I'm holding every day in my good thoughts. As Nilanjan mentioned, the technological possibilities for connection presented by online platforms, as well as the solidarity of scholars, have been a lifeline for me over these past many months, and have certainly sustained me and lifted my spirits, even in the darkest of moments. And for that, I am very grateful. I'm also very grateful to my wonderful commissioning editor, Chirag Thakkar at Rowley Books in New Delhi. And in fact, the whole brilliant team at Rowley, who worked under the toughest conditions of lockdown and other pandemic challenges to ensure that this book was published last year in the course of a series of events that came to be called Gandhi at 150, marking the 150th birth anniversary of MK Gandhi. I hope at some point we can talk about the role of anniversaries such as this in sparking spikes in public and scholarly interest in the phenomenon that we call the Mahatma. Although my own research on Gandhi and visual culture started about a decade ago, this book is very much part of Rowley's effort to create a series of short works aimed at a general public. I am delighted, in fact, that a sonic companion to my visual history is fellow historian Lakshmi Subramaniam's wonderful book on Gandhi and music, another angle from which to get to questions of creativity, aesthetics, and politics in Gandhian thought and practice. I was also delighted with Chirag's invitation, since it enabled me to participate in what I see as a salutary trend of engaging in public humanities. Writing as a professional academic for a wider public, we're not necessarily interested in theoretical or conceptual intricacies, or my historiographical interventions or pet peeves, or even my long footnotes was certainly a challenge. But I was keen to take on this challenge, especially since the public knowledge of and about Gandhi is frequently at odds with the shifting academic and scholarly knowledge on the man. Another topic for us to possibly discuss further. So the question of audience, the role of the scholarly enterprise, especially in our charged political times, when Gandhi has been put to uses quite contrary to his own principles, and the global reach of some of his ideas, including of disobedience, were all part of the mix as I was conceiving this book. As I note in the preface, the stakes for me for doing this project were definitely political and ethical. But they're also deeply intellectual, and I wrote this book, even though it is about images and art, very consciously as a professional historian. The historical scholarship on Gandhi is vast, as we all know. It seems obligatory for historians of 20th century India to have something to say about him. It is almost a rite of passage for us, and brings to mind the title of a wonderful article written about a decade ago by fellow historian Ritu Birla with the smart title, "Might as well face it, we are addicted to Gandhi." The we in this case being especially historians. Now, though I write as a historian, my book does not offer a conventional historical narrative with an identifiable historical arc of development. I do, however, explore questions such as, when does Gandhi first come to the attention of the professional artist of India, and where and in what manner? The book actually begins with some of these early images, although to this day, I am so regretful about not finding an early portrait put on display in a London gallery around 1925 by the Bene Israeli turned Muslim artist Samuel Faizi Ramin. Parenthetically, I should say that I have an ongoing interest in the global artistic and curatorial community's investment in Gandhi, but I have barely scratched the surface of this topic. Now, be that as it may, I was interested in these early works, of course, in and of themselves, but also for the manner in which they get cited in later works into our own times, and the purposes they serve in such acts of repurposing. For instance, the delicate youngish Gandhi from an early Tagore painting is a recurrent citation in contemporary artist Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh's beautiful works, which I read as the artist's attempt to recall Gandhi at his dialogic best. As a historian, one of my driving concerns is with the historical photograph of Gandhi. Gandhi, I have suggested, is the most photographed Indian of his time, yet we know so very little about the contexts in which his numerous proliferating photographs were taken. There is no rigorous scholarship on the circulation history of these images in his own time, let alone since, when they are used, sometimes even by the best of scholars in rather uncritical ways. In the book, I have focused on the afterlife of some photographs in some artworks and explored some consequences of their repurposing as such. But there is so much more to be done in this regard, and I would welcome a discussion on this as well. As a disciplinary historian, an engagement with image worlds has propelled me into a realm not constituted exclusively by words and texts. I have felt compelled to engage with images to get to truths otherwise occluded by focusing entirely on the verbal, which is the case for so much historical scholarship on Gandhi. Hence also my interest in the three themes around which the book is organized: the art of bearing, the art of walking, and the art of dying, where his disobedience, or living at an angle from the norm, is most on display. As I observe, Gandhi himself frequently used the word art, or its equivalent kala in Gujarati and Hindi, when he referred to various activities and projects he undertook. But it is engaging as a historian with the image that enabled me to drill down into the proliferating ways in which he came to see all of life, ending with death, as art. As I have also learned to expect from doing visual history, the surprising discovery of images has propelled me to ask questions that I had not anticipated when immersed in my own text-based archive. As with the unexpected coda in chapter 4 of the book on the representational dilemmas facing the artist of India on whether or not to paint Gandhi's assassin. In all of this, I make no case for the sovereignty of the visual image or of the artwork. On the contrary, a shuttling back and forth between the discursive and the figural is critical to the method I have adopted. as indeed a shuttling back and forth between Gandhi as choreographer and master manager of his own image and the images produced by artists across various media in his own time and since. I therefore read the visual culture that has emerged around Gandhi as a project of co-creation, even if it is uneven and asymmetrical. There is a profound irony, one among many others that I dwell upon in the book, in using the image to anchor my reflections on Gandhi, considering his own stated ambivalence regarding the work of art in our times. In what I have characterized as the willful disobedience to his own stated artists, to his own stated desire, artists of India have invested in him in a manner quite unparalleled for any other political figure of his time or even since. So in the course of this project, I therefore became very interested in what I came to see as a visual culture of obedience that built up around the supremely disobedient man. There is very little by way of a critique that emerges from among the established gallery artists of India, or even those who produce for the mass market. Instead, the artworks seek to singularize him, to extract and abstract him from the very movement that made him possible, with a corresponding effacement of the multitude that, after all, also made him into what he was. So the artist of disobedience appears to be ironically complicit with the operations by which a hyper-icon was created and consolidated. Signs of artistic disobedience are there, but few and far between. Considering, for example, the many conservative implications for gender relations in Gandhian thought and practice, I expected to find it among women artists, but I didn't or haven't so far. Criticisms of Gandhi's complicated and traditionalist views on Varnashrama dharma or caste have powerfully emerged among some Dalit artists of today, such as J. Nandakumar, or among upcoming artists such as Pinak Banik. On the other hand, artists of the stature of G.G. Skaria and Riaz Komu have attempted what I read as a visual reconciliation of Gandhi and Ambedkar in the image realm, quite at odds with the contemporary Dalit discourse on them, and even academic writing in some sectors on these two rivaling father figures. I close with an image with which I began, Talur Ellen's enigmatic, fascinating sculpture, which I also chose as the cover of the book. It exemplifies for me what is perhaps the critical paradox I've sought to explore, namely that in spite of the lavishing of all this artistic attention on him, and notwithstanding the fact that the contemporary artist has emerged as the critical conscience keeper, Gandhi is a hallowed but hollow figure. His image is hyper-visible and over-remembered across the Indian visual landscape, but really his complicated ideas are hardly a palpable presence. Bruno Latour has insistently reminded us that we live in times in which we are witness, quote, to a fabulous population of new images, fresh icons, rejuvenated mediators, greater flows of media, more powerful ideas, stronger idols, end quote. Has all the work performed by the artist over the century and more made M.K. Gandhi a stronger idol? This remains for me an open-ended, productive question, and one that I would also love to engage with everyone around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumathi. That was absolutely brilliant as a summary, and I'm sure it couldn't have been easy to do that in the time that was allotted to you. But we will surely have reason to come back to several of the issues you mentioned later on in the discussion. May I now invite Tridip Suhrud to make his comments. Tridip is Provost of CEPT University in Ahmedabad, where he's also Professor and Director of the CEPT Archives. Tridip is the author of the globally acclaimed critical edition of Gandhis and Autobiography, or The Story of My Experiments with Truth, which is introduced and annotated by him. Tridip, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Sumathi, let me begin by saying what a wonderful experience it has been to hold the book in one's hands, and absolutely delightful production. I want to take you back to a lecture that you gave in Delhi some 4 years ago, which was your inaugural lecture as the president of the American Institute of Indian Studies. And one thing that we spoke about there was this. For me, what was the most amazing gift that Gandhi gave, not Gandhi, but the others around him gave to us, which is the absence of the camera at the moment of his assassination. Here is this person who's been photographed, sometimes and mostly against his will, rarely posing, rarely looking into the eye of the camera, but very much being photographed, doing everything and sometimes trying to do nothing. But here at this very climactic moment of his life, and they were very, very renowned photographers who had just met him the previous day, that very day. But fortunately for us, I think they were not there. And I say fortunately for us, they were not there because they've allowed us to imagine that moment. Not only us as academics or as artists, but as people. I think part of the art that Gandhi practiced, of what he called nonviolence, was also the art of dying. And I fear that if that moment had been captured in any form by a camera, we would have been robbed of that magnificent imagination, and also something that continues to haunt us. It continues to haunt us to think as to what the person who fired the bullets thought at that very moment, what his face or eyes betrayed. Did his hand shake? How did Gandhi slump down in arms of Manu? How did Manu and Abha respond, or the people around it? I think it's really allowed us to imagine and therefore relive that moment. And I think as people of India, it's been important that we relive that moment. Part of the fact that Gandhi continues to occupy a certain space, not a very important space, a certain space in our moral imagination, in our imagination in moments of crisis, is because of that absence. I think that the entire artistic world has become richer, not only those painting Gandhi's assassination, but also those who are looking at Gandhi in other ways. As you say, speak of Gandhi, the man walking, the man sitting down, the man reading, performing various tasks. All of those things we are able to imagine. We are able to go beyond the frame of the camera and the photograph. Even when somebody like Atul Dodia looks at a photograph and works on it, he's able to go beyond it because of the absence of that very defining photograph. And I think that section of yours in that book, which does allude to that fact of the absence of the camera, is very important, because I think it's a central fact which in a very basic way freed us in some ways, and it also burdened us in other ways, because it becomes our responsibility to constantly imagine that moment. And that's the way we keep that moral compass alive. Having said that, I think and therefore the art of disobedience, or what you talk about, becomes important. Because what Gandhi, the only thing that he disobeyed was the assassin in a very fundamental way. Because and those who know Gandhi's last years know that this is something that he constantly imagines. This is something, and Ashish Nandi very early on caught on to this and spoke about Gandhi's willing his own death, in some ways conspiring with his assassin in his way to author this event, or to make this event happen. But even if we were to not go as far as saying that they were collaborators, but here is somebody who imagines a particular kind of a death, who imagines dying a violent death, so that you could provide a final justification of what he liked to call an object lesson in the act and the art of nonviolence. And it's really that. So in some ways, he robs the assassin and all those who wanted him dead at that point, and all of us who want him dead now, that act of killing him. Because here is somebody who's saying, no, before you can think the thought, I have imagined, lived it, spoken about it, told Manu time and again that this is what you would be required to do. So I think that and the way you build after that section, the book, is very fascinating, because none of those things that come after, Hakusha, very importantly in your narrative, Ghulam Sheikh, Atul Dodia, Gigis Kharia, all of those really become possible because he's somebody who's allowing us to imagine things differently. Imagine things differently, both at the level of the popular culture, because there is an entire section in your work which looks at the calendar art. Fascinating calendar art which speaks of Gandhi's presence in the heaven. There is that very beautiful calendar art that a poster that you have, which puts Gandhi ascending to heaven in a way that can be imagined only if you have that entire history before us, both in terms of the visual history of thinking of heaven and somebody an embodied person ascending to heaven, and how difficult that is. So I think that is really, really crucial what you've done, and hats off to you. I want to close by saying giving you a project or even a footnote to do after this, because one sculpture which captures our present relationship to Gandhi is a sculpture in South Africa. And I'm not talking about Tinker Christopher's very beautiful young man Gandhi in his barrister's robes, his robes windswept, and in some ways sitting very lightly in the government square in Johannesburg. That's not the sculpture that I'm talking about. In 2018, for reasons that all of us understand, we decided to install one more sculpture, and this time at the Pietermaritzburg railway station. And that sculpture for me captures what we had set out to do, which is to make Gandhi a double-faced person, double-faced with all the implications of what that term being Janus-faced actually means. There are two faces to this sculpture. It's golden in color. At the railway station platform, and a young Gandhi and an old Gandhi taking away everything, probably, from that simple plaque that Nelson Mandela had placed there, which is to say a new beginning in history of nonviolence began here. That's something that you need to look at, and we hope that we are able to do so. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Nilanjan.
Thank you very much, Tridip, and thank you once again for sticking to time. May I now invite Monica Juneja, but before I do that, could I just announce once again for those who have joined this event slightly later, that you are very welcome to pose your questions in the chat box, which we will pose to the panelists once the presentations, the initial remarks are over and the discussion begins, which will be shortly. So please do pose your questions in the chat box. Monica Juneja is Professor of Global Art History at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies, Asia and Europe at the University of Heidelberg. And her forthcoming book, to be published later this year, is titled Can Art History Be Made Global? Meditations from the Periphery. Monica, please speak now, and you have about 10 minutes. Sorry, Monica, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Yes, thanks very much, Nilanjan, for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate in it. And thank you above all, Sumathi, for giving us such a rich and riveting book. And not least, I must add a word of appreciation to Roli Books for producing it so beautifully. Your book has such fascinating insights. Sometimes I don't know where to start. So I've just picked out a few aspects which, for me, you know, as an art historian who works in the interstices of art history and history, have certain questions which I'd like to kind of throw back to you so that we can continue this conversation. First of all, I can only add my voice to your call to historians that they enrich their archive by incorporating visual representations and building these into the arguments. I mean, you've shown us how you do this. It brings with it, of course, the methodological proposition of going beyond using images or material objects, you know, as simply as a passive surface from which you can unproblematically read off history. You know, you don't see the image simply as an extra bit of evidence that confirms what you already know through textual materials. Instead, the challenge is to unpack visual materials, paintings, prints, photographs, things that you've used in your book, you know, to unravel their dynamics and to look for their specific efficacy. This is a term I borrow from Kajri Jain. So that the images then bring forth a set of, you know, a fresh set of questions and point to the tracks that the historian has yet to explore. And you are really, Sumathi, one of the rare historians of South Asia who have taken on this challenge. And this entry, you know, with the visual, I've been following so much of your work, is characterized so many of your works, you know, the Mughal Muraqqa, on which we had a lot of shared conversations, on cartography, on the Raj paintings of M.F. Hussain, and not least the fascinating study of visualizing the nation as goddess and mother. Another scholar who has creatively drawn on an archive of images is my colleague at Heidelberg, Kama McLean, you know, whose work on the Indian revolutionary movement during the interwar years also draws on such material and intersects with your study of Gandhi. And I bring this up because I want to get back to it later at the end of my short presentation. But let me remain for the moment with your work. Now, while the goddess and the nation drew primarily on a particular genre of images, you know, which we collectively refer to as popular or mass-produced images, calendar art, posters, oleographs, or woodcuts, this latest book, as the title Gandhi in the Gallery tells us, draws on a different corpus of images. And these are works created by professional artists, by painters, sculptors, photographers, and mixed media artists whose practice lies in modernist and contemporary idioms, and whose work is then addressed to a gallery-going public, though, of course, through the internet, it circulates even beyond that public, as you yourself have observed. Now, these are artists who deploy a language which is accessible to those with knowledge about the meanings of art as a modernist concept. And these are works that you would expect to feature in the writings of art historians, but strangely, there too, they seem to have fallen by the wayside, even though we have many wonderful works on some of the renowned artists whose productions that we encounter in your book. So in that sense too, it is a real treasure trove. But I want to come back to the second part of your title, which is the art of disobedience. And this led me to mull over different possibilities of disobedience and over this paradox of obedience at the heart of disobedience that you discuss. So let me just recapitulate by separating the different strands. On the one level, you use disobedience in reference to Gandhi himself, whom you describe as a quintessential artist and whose disobedience is articulated in his creation of an ethical mode of opposition and resistance, through his bodily regime and sartorial practice. I think you call it somatic disobedience. Then art of disobedience moves to a second register, and this, as you spelled out, is the response of artists to Gandhian disobedience. I suppose at one level, they disregard and disobey this inflationary use of the Gandhian image, which you've just said, is emptied out of its content and appropriated across a political spectrum. The stunning work of Talur, or even the one by Gigi Scaria in your book, show you this. So this is creating art to lampoon or to counter ubiquitous cliches that could be read, therefore, as a form of disobedience. But then you propose even more than that. And this is where, as an art historian, I sort of started getting uncertain, and I'd like you to maybe talk a bit more about this, because the works that you have chosen to study, modernist or contemporary art, all remain faithful to the qualities of that genre. This is art for the gallery, and art, which it's for institutions that ratify these work as art. In other words, art which comes to be recognized as such by a select set of viewers via its transgressive functions, via its right to critique, to express irreverence, to provoke, to break taboos. In this sense, this work by Oshim Purkayastha, which you just showed, Gandhi's face on a postage stamp morphing into Hitler's. It's a form of provocation, extreme provocation, depending on, where it's seen, and crossing the boundaries of the so-called thinkable. So however you might judge this provocation, the provocation as such is being perfectly obedient to the norms, of the domain where this art is ensconced and the expectations of its viewers. So I've been kind of puzzling over the line that you draw between these two groups of works, those that rescue the image of Gandhi, from this prison of platitudes. And you say that they cultivate obedience because of their oratorizing function. And then there are those that deploy caricature, irony, or explicit critique, like those of the Dalit artists. So this is the line you draw, but I would like you to flesh out a bit more where disobedience is actually located between these two. That's one point. But let's remain with the concept of art itself. I mean, you just pointed out that Gandhi refers to a whole range of his activities within the praxis of civil disobedience as art. In fact, his whole critique of industrial modernity was, if you like, enacted as a performance. Each gesture had this extremely performative quality, bending down to gather grains of salt, of burning cloth, of marching, sweeping, spinning, even dying was an art, as you eloquently write. And of course, his sensitivity to this expressive power of simple objects. Now, Gandhi's frequent harnessing of this notion of art seems interestingly to have prefigured its expansive meaning in contemporary times. And to this meaning, today, I think he brought two important additional dimensions. One is of ethics, and the other is the practice of making itself. And this is something which Ananda Kumaraswamy wrote about in his book on the Indian artisan. And he describes it as an innate dimension of art that has, however, got suppressed within modernism. So I found it really remarkable that this is, something that Gandhi brings into his concepts. And what is also remarkable in Gandhi's understanding and practice, it transcends a major, Gandhi was talking about art at a time of this high modernist definition of art as autonomous practice, and which builds in this distinction, which separates aesthetic concerns from so-called utility, art from work. And this is a fault line that we will continue to live with, and it's this distinction has generated issues that have poignantly surfaced in this ongoing pandemic, where large numbers of practitioners in different fields, clubbed as the arts, have been pushed into precarity because they're not recognized as work. To remain with Gandhi, his critique of industrial modernity, which became a point of contention in Nehruvian India. Your book argues that for artists today, he incarnates the ideas with which to articulate positions against growing geopolitical violence, to warn us against the degeneration of national sentiment into xenophobia, into the threat of fascism, to warn us against the evasion of social responsibility within neoliberal capitalism. And artists, you tell us, lean on the figure of Gandhi. In fact, you use the word crutch, and I'd like to come back to that in the discussion in this context. And the artists use the figure of Gandhi to signal towards this dangerous erosion of secularism and tolerance. And this is even though Gandhi himself had clearly positioned himself in the religious domain. Now, one central dimension of Gandhian ethics is about rethinking the bond between humans and nature. And, Partha Mittar, in his study of modernist art, called Gandhi the most primitivist critic of industrial civilization. Now, without going into what I consider to be some of the conceptual problems in this use of the term primitivism, it is an aspect that, that Gandhian ideas take on a renewed relevance for cultural politics today in a present which is scarred by environmental degradation. We are overshadowed today by the threat of climate catastrophes and pandemics, and several artists have responded to these issues. They've produced an art driven by the discourses of the Anthropocene, and one that blurs the boundaries between art making and activism. I'm thinking of the work of artists like Shiba Chachi or Atul Bhalla, or photographers like Ravi Agarwal, the documentary filmmaker Siddharth Kak, who's was placed very much within the activism of the Narmada Bachao movement. So I do wonder why this stream of contemporary art has not brought itself into relationship with Gandhi. And I was wondering if your archive allows you an insight into this, how you would explain it. Okay, now two further observations and related questions. The first relates to the choice of artists you discuss. Your images all center stage, above all, the physical persona with Gandhi. You zoom into that and you discuss that with great sensitivity and acumen. That's a decisive position in your book. And I wondered if that was a position that also was a criterion for governing your selection of images. Because I was struck by the absence of what to me is one of the most powerful renderings of the Gandhian call to civil disobedience that does not portray his person. And I'm thinking of this work by Jitish Kalat. This was one of his, public notice series, where the artist, he transcribes the entire text of Gandhi's speech on the eve of the Dandi March. And he uses these simulated bones of fiberglass to form each letter of the alphabet. So there were some 4,500 pieces of these glass bones, which are set against then this background of this very deep turmeric yellow. Now, bones could suggest macabre bodily remains. They could be seen as metaphorically as ossified content. And yet this is a work that focuses the viewer to engage with it at another pace, because you have to walk slowly along the panels and read every word of a text that was passionately spoken. So you have to introspect then on the gap between the heard and the written speech. So Gandhi is sensorially present in this experience of the work without his physical persona being represented at all. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this. And finally, let me return to the issue I started with, which is the historian's use of a visual archive. And I find myself placing your book together with Kamar MacLean's wonderful analysis of Bhagat Singh, who is a figure like Gandhi, who actively choreographed his image. And, Kama has argued, using these visual materials, that's wonderful chapter that she has on this hat, this Bhagat Singh dressed in his stylish Western clothes and the rakish hat, so quite a contrast to in that sense. And she argues that he creates his own distinct iconography of a martyr hero, being fully aware of his impending death. Again, there's a parallel to Gandhi, and we are told. And another extremely interesting image in MacLean's book, which conjoins the two figures, Gandhi and Bhagat Singh, is who are conventionally held to represent two opposite and incommensurable poles of the struggle for self-determination, is this print of Gandhi opening his chest in this Hanuman-like gesture, to reveal the portraits of Bhagat Singh and two revolutionaries. And MacLean uses this material to persuasively argue that images can make us sensitive to the ethics of violent and non-violent struggle as forming a kind of a reciprocal conjunction. And this is an insight that we lose within the more canonical text-based historiography of nationalism. So, as I said, I saw these books talking to each other, but still, I would like to know if you see your study of civil disobedience, which is mediated through art in dialogue with other kinds of work like this. And more broadly, what should historians be then attending to? You've said some of this in reading of images, but I'd just like to hear your thoughts on this. And thank you again for one splendid book. One more splendid book, I should say.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you. Very kind of you to give such extended comments. May I now introduce Anselm Franke, who will be moderating the discussion today. Anselm completed his PhD titled The Third House, The Language of Essay Exhibition from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London, and is currently head of visual arts and film at the Haus der Kulturen Welt, which is HKW, Berlin, where he has been since 2013. Anselm will now begin the discussion. Anselm, I have one question already, but we will bring them in slowly as the discussion progresses. Okay, thank you. Please begin, Anselm.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for setting this beautiful stage for this important book. And thank you, Sumathi, for your generous short presentation of its content, and as well for the really intellectual deep engagement of Tridip and Monica. I think that, Sumathi, I think it would be probably best if you, before we lose too many of the many points that were raised, you first address those of these points that are the closest to you and that you feel like are on your tongue now. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to, of course, thank both Tridip and Monica, two scholars who have, influenced me in so many different ways and different facets of my intellectual life for your thoughtful engagement and such interesting insights and comments. And I'm going to write privately to both of you to ask me to share your written comments with me, though I know I have the recording too, because I need to dwell and reflect further. But what I want to do is to respond maybe to two thoughts that each of, amongst the many thoughts, two of the thoughts that each of you have posed, so that we can have a dialogue. So it's not just me going on and on. I want to begin with Tridip's comment about the photograph. And I'm so glad you brought it up, Tridip, because this is for me an ongoing interest, as I noted in my opening comments. And I hope, in my lifetime, I'm able to finish a big project actually on the creation of these, the archives on Gandhi's photographs, which is a hugely important historical project as well. But I want to pick up on the point you made, that the photograph comes to us as both a burden and gives us an opportunity. You use the word freedom, but I think I want to go with opportunity. I think if you look at the photographs of Gandhi, and if you can actually end up by doing a history of Gandhi, which I think is going to be give us a surprisingly different take if we just go from photograph to photograph. That is something that is waiting to be done, right? So it provides a tremendous resource and opportunity for us to get at a different kind of angle on this man, especially from his earlier years as an adult in South Africa, where there is a rich body of photographs. And I think there is many, many more, I'm sure, buried in the South African archives that I hope that at some point I'll get to, where we are going to learn something different about him as a person, right? So I think the photograph gives, and this exhibit that some of us collaborated on and did a few years ago in Heidelberg with the Swiss-German photographer Walter Bossard, again, brought a different set of, nuances to the Gandhi that we didn't know about. I'm so intrigued, for example, I've gotten intrigued by looking at these photographs, for instance, about Gandhi and his mustache. Why, of all of the other things that this man did to be disobedient, he did not shave off his mustache, right? What does it say about him and masculinity, for one? But what is it about the mustache that remains? I ask this because it was looking at a photograph of Bossard, of Gandhi shaving, that alerted me to this, right? So I think the photograph can act as a trigger and an opportunity to begin to ask new questions. So it is an opportunity. But it also comes as a burden, exactly as you pointed out, right? Because because of the power of the photograph, because of all of what we know about the history of the photograph, it's sort of claimed to be, speaking a certain kind of truth and all of that. It also limits, it also frames what we can or cannot say about Gandhi, which is why I was so intrigued, and you were so instrumental in getting me to think about it, about the camera-free death, as I call it, and how it opens up an opportunity for that moment of his death to be interpreted in so very many different ways. And I have to say, because this is a short book, I only captured a little bit of all of that. There are many more things to say about that. So thank you for that. Thank you also for the project that you've given me on the South African statue, but also more generally of the place of South African artists. I mentioned in passing that I have just begun to work on the global interest in Gandhi, global artistic community's interest in Gandhi, and South Africa in particular holds a very important role. I'm fascinated, for example, by a South African artist called Willem Hendricks. And you know this image because it is reproductions of this image are there in almost all Gandhi museums, called The Martyr of the 20th Century, which he was provoked to make on hearing in South Africa of Gandhi's death. But I'm also very interested in the statues of Gandhi that have gone up in South Africa and are being brought down in light of, Black Lives Matter, which is also very, very important context for us to be thinking about. And really for me to, in the next stage of this project, where I want to look at signs of disobedience to, puncture this, what I'm calling the visual culture of obedience, the current discourse about Gandhi's statues, questions of Gandhi and race, Gandhi's attitude towards Black South Africans, all of that is very, very important for me. And I did not know about this particular statue in Maritzburg. And so thank you for that. And I will be following up with that. Monica, as always, so many wonderful thoughts and questions. And thank you for connecting my work with Kama, a historian who I love and deeply respect, and have engaged with in other areas. But what you alerted me to, I have been really obsessing about Gandhi in relationship to two other big men in the Indian political landscape. Nehru, of course, with whom he's often featured in artworks, and Ambedkar, for whom obviously I end with him, and I'm fascinated and I'm working on this little project on Gandhi and Ambedkar. But really, in this particular project, I did not think of Gandhi and Bhagat Singh. In my Goddess and the Nation, of course, it was a big part of that analysis, the fact that they are brought together in calendar art. But your comments and connecting this book with Kama's wonderful scholarship alerts me to, I don't think I can immediately think of any contemporary gallery professional artist who has tried to bring Gandhi and Bhagat Singh together. And I really need to think about that. But bringing up Bhagat Singh confirms for me the point that I make, which is in spite of all of the investment in Bhagat Singh visually, right, which Penny has written about, of course, Kama has written about, and others have written about, Bhagat Singh does not seem to attract the kind of attention of the gallery artist, right? He does at the popular art level, and there are some artists I can think of who are paying attention, but it doesn't have that kind of purchase that Gandhi has. So it's something interesting for me to bring Bhagat Singh also into the conversation. So I really would like to think more about this. The other point I want to, there are two others I think I should very quickly note. One of the points of historical developments that I was following is artists for whom Gandhi is an end in himself versus others for whom he's actually a means to another end. So in fact, that is sort of the arc that I'm seeing between those who painted or sculpted or focused on Gandhi in his own lifetime versus in our world, where they're actually using the figure of Gandhi and the ideals that they see that the figure of Gandhi embodies to actually attend to many other questions, including, I would say, questions of environmental degradation. I only scratched the surface on this, but there is a great project waiting to be done on that. Finally, I do want to make a point about Jitish Kalat. It was heartbreaking to me that I could not bring in public notice as well as covering letter. I could only put that in the footnotes. And that is because in a short book like this, there is so much more that can be said, right? I wanted to keep my focus on Gandhi and the body. That is the arc that rises. And in fact, the disappearance of the body is something I am interested in, where Gandhi comes to be represented by his objects, where he's come, the spinning wheel or the staff, or sometimes even the gun, fascinatingly, comes to stand in for him, right? But really, because I was interested in showing how this artwork contributes to the development of the concept of the bio-icon. I don't do very much with it, given that this is a work of public scholarship on the theoretical exploration of that wonderful concept that I owe to Bishnupriya Ghosh, the cultural theorist. But I was very much focused on what is being done with the body itself. Now, you could come back to me, and you would be right to do so, and argue, well, the bone comes to stand in for the body, right? And I did toy with this when I was trying to figure out how to bring this in. And then, you know, as you saw, I just had to put it into a footnote. So you're right to call me out on that. But that accounted hugely for why I chose the kind artists that I did. Those who got me to continue to pay attention to Gandhi's Body, which of course has been such a focus of historical scholarship in recent times. And that was also my taking off point, right? So I'll stop there. There is so much more to be said, but I would love to, you know, so that it's not just me speaking. So I'll stop there, yeah.
Also given the fact that each one of you is in the your own way so scholarly invested in the topic, and perhaps not all of our listeners are in the same way, perhaps a way to take a step back and also open this up a little bit would be to turn to the kind of currency this powerful political iconology has in the present moment of a crisis-ridden political landscape in India in particular, but not only in India, no? Because obviously I'd like to catch up with that maybe a little bit later, but one of the things that really impressed me, or that I was made very aware of when going through your book, was the way in which the figure, but also the iconic rendering of the figure, addresses itself to very different audiences in a kind of really complicated entanglement, no, of the colonial situation, of the different cultural legacies, and of course political theology. So perhaps we could just start with this one part, with this first part on what's the currency, what's the impact that this figure has in the current landscape, or is there, to put it another way, is there a way to think that disobedience perhaps could be incommensurable with the current nationalism?
Do you want
Would you like to give it a go?
Or with others coming in? Well, maybe I can begin with just one observation, and then I would love to hear from Monica and Tridip, especially about the current currency, as you put it. One way we can think about the way his iconography gets remobilized in our times is by the use of Gandhi's spectacles. In a movement that the current government of current political dispensation in India has used for its campaign called Swachh Bharat, or Cleaning India. Right. So fascinatingly, and the icon for the movement itself became just a pair of glasses, and one didn't have to have any other language really came to stand for. And it was one of the ways in which the current, the contemporary political project tried to hook itself to Gandhi's own concerns with public health, with sanitation, with cleaning up India, if you will, right? So that's one image. One can also make a very important comment about the way in which Gandhi's spinning wheel, you know, has also been used in very important ways. For me, a very important contemporary image that stands out in my mind is when President Xi of China visited India soon after Prime Minister Modi came to power, and they both met up in Ahmedabad in Gandhi's ashram. And there is this photograph which harkens back to Margaret Bourke-White's photograph, Gandhi's, of the famous photograph that I showed, but of these two men now, Modi and Xi, at the spinning wheel, right? So if you are a future historian or even a contemporary historian, there's a fantastic connection of cascading images where the resonance of that image of Modi and Xi at Gandhi's spinning wheel, you know, has with this earlier ancestry of images, right, of Gandhi. So those are 2 points I think I can add to the discussion here. And then, of course, you asked the question about the global resonance too, right? Of this kind of staff-bearing, lightly clad man who becomes sort of the standard statue image of Gandhi everywhere in different parts of the world. And I'm particularly interested in that, especially because of the arguments I make in The Art of Bearing and the kind of ambivalence, especially in the West, to seeing so much brown flesh, right? The male brown flesh on display. And then, of course, you have all these statues which come up, which end up by showing quite a bit of that, right? Yeah. Don't know whether I'm getting to some of your points.
Monica, do you want to give a response?
Yeah, I'm yeah, I'm thinking about two things here, you know, relating to the current landscape. And this is the point Sumathi also mentioned, I think somewhere, either it was in our conversation or it was the end of your book, an open question, which I've been giving thought to, is of contemporary artists. You know, why are there such few women artists who have engaged with Gandhi, and does it intersect with the kind of ambivalence that we have about Gandhi's, you know, relationship to gender? That is a question. And as far as nationalism goes, which is the question that you posed, Anselm, I think this is the dilemma of a figure who's who's associated at one level with a kind of anti-colonial nationalism, and so which means that figure can be, and we see this, can be appropriated, you know, in the name of the nation, in the name of all kinds of nationalisms, you know, for so many different purposes. And that is, you know, located in India. This is the kind of dilemma that, you know, we have, and something that, you know, so Sumathi is using these artists as also disobedient to that kind of appropriation. On the other hand, you know, if you think of it beyond just the context of India and anti-colonial nationalism, and in terms of a kind of a much more global resonance, I think the importance, and I think that might be also one way of, you know, rescuing Gandhi from this trap of empty nationalist, opportunist nationalist appropriation, is the kind of the ethical content of that struggle, which then can get delinked from a kind of xenophobic, inward-looking national sentiment. So I think maybe that kind of global reception could also be a form of rescue.
Tridip, do you want to share your thoughts?
No, two things. One, let's try and understand is what is it that you do with the father of the nation. The best thing that you can do to the father of the nation is to kill him, which we accomplished. And then you go out and empty him out completely. How do you go about doing that? By naming real estate. I mean, every town, every village which has a paved road has a Mahatma Gandhi road. Collectively, the length of all MG roads is larger than the Grand Trunk Road in India. Every time you have a square of any kind, you place a statue. And everything, life goes around that statue. Ritually to be dusted and cleaned twice a year, now only once a year. So what we have really gone about doing is created the perfect kind of distance that you need to create between us and this very overbearing father of the nation that we gave unto ourselves. He was reluctant to be a father. He was reluctant to be even the father of the nation. So that happens. And then we go about exporting him. The Indian state goes about exporting him. The only thing that we exported more than Gandhi before that, which was not the Indian state, was the figure of Buddha. But both require an exile from home. the greater the success of the export, more emptying out happens. And I think in both instances, we've managed to do that. Buddha came to be rescued by two people, Dr. Ambedkar and the present Dalai Lama. I don't think there is anybody coming to rescue Gandhi, and for good reason. I don't think he needs rescuing. It's an unfinished work, and let him remain that way. It's good to have an imperfect person rather than imagine when people say, oh, he had so many faults. And my response has always been to myself, it's been, imagine if that man were even more perfect. He would have been completely unbearable. The way, because we can engage with him, we can have quarrels with him, we can critique him, we are dismayed by him, disappointed in him because of this unfinished nature of who that person was and what that person was becoming. So I think we've succeeded in emptying him out by placing him in every choraha, and that's what I call Khade Raho Gandhi. Stand there, but say nothing.
Nilanjan, you also wanted to weigh in?
I just wanted to make a point. Thank you for asking this question, Anselm. Sumathi, this actually ties up with the point that you were making initially, and it appears in your book as well, which is about the afterlife of works. And my question is, and the question is partly to Anselm as well, to answer about whether it happens in other situations or not. You are very well aware, Sumathi, from your own earlier work, which we know, that a lot of artists have works whose afterlives become controversial. Here, we are talking about a person who has become art. And my question to you was, are there any representations that have become controversial within the moving political currency of the times, both within India, through the 60s, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, way into now? Because, as you know, for instance, that Nehru has become controversial. So one of my questions was this something that ever crossed your path in terms of you saw a visual and you thought this was potentially controversial or could be controversial, or you heard that it had become controversial? That's one. The other thing was I wanted you to say a bit more about the whole question of anniversaries, because that's something partly that Tridip also referred to. And as all of you who have been to London, and most definitely Anselm will know, that we also have a square which also has a Gandhi sitting in it, cross-legged, Tavistock Square, so who also does not say anything, sits silently. So would you want to, I'd be keen to hear what Monica and Tridip also have to say about, this whole question of afterlife and controversies when the person becomes the object of art. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance. Could I just say we have a few questions as well, but I'll wait for my turn to ask them.
Very quickly, thank you, Nilanjan. I will, because so much has been said, and thank you both, Monica and Tridip, for those wonderful thoughts, especially about the father of the nation, because that is also very much on my mind. But to very quickly address, Nilanjan, your very important question about which image becomes controversial or have images become controversial. Yes, and one I was very keen to include in the book, and I definitely asked permission. Of course, all the living artists, their book permissions have been sought, is the one by the Dalit artist, which I also showed very, very definitely and conscientiously in the presentation, Nanda Kumar. When these works, which you saw were very powerful and which I analyze a little bit in the book, were shown for the first time in Mumbai, he was asked to take them down because they showed, Gandhi not as the savior of the Harijan, but as somebody who was a slayer, right? He was asked to take them down. And so that would be the immediate answer I would give to that, your question.
Yeah.
Oh, and a question about anniversaries. May I, if I can take a minute? Yes, for me as a historian, methodologically, that became very important. As I began working on the project, I realized that actually, as I was working my way through the archive, when would I expect to see a sudden constellation of artworks or a sudden constellation of new interest around Gandhi? And it was around, various anniversaries, the anniversaries of the Salt March, certainly the very first anniversary of his death, which is, how I closed the book with a landmark exhibit with which I began, with which I think the real afterlife of Gandhi as an art project begins, as I've argued. So the question on anniversaries is an important one for me methodologically as well, because it allowed me to look, for in the archive for these moments of what I call spikes of interest. And certainly the 150th anniversary, as I was doing the book, artists were producing images left, right, and center. And, there is much more to be said about all of the art that came out just in 2019, 2020. And there's an enormous amount that has come out, and only a couple of these are in the book because there's only so much I could include. So I think many of these were commissioned, right? Also, so there is an argument to be made also here, which I don't go into at all, about the political economy of the art world, right? Where suddenly money becomes available for artists to get engaged, where exhibitions become possible and all of that, and how that also then contributes to making a figure visible, or again, hyper-visible, if you will, huh?
Mm. Perhaps like two observations. On the one hand, I see like the impression I got, and Monica explained, I think, many of these aspects extremely well regarding to the way in which many of these images kind of sit a bit oddly in the historiography of art, in the canon building around modern art, decentered modernism, even, etc. There's these two aspects, right? On the one hand, it is Gandhi in art, Gandhi as art, but Gandhi's art sitting in a kind of relationship of tension with the concept of art, at least insofar as it is derived from both a history of, a value category of the 19th century, more or less, or late 18th century, and a kind of derived from a Western system of the arts. On the other hand, it is really a book about political iconography, and I couldn't help even be reminded permanently of the kind of, this kind of almost subterranean, sometimes hyper-visible, sometimes foreclosed dimension of Christian iconology in the making of the modern world, in the sense of going back to sort of the martyr of martyrs, the sacrifice of all sacrifices, and the various ways in which it addresses itself to a kind of subaltern body politics or body polity. And a state making, father of the nation kind of, in Christian genealogy, you would say after Paul, no? And this together with the kind of fact of, being the martyr of the 20th century, what would that, like, I was just wondering whether we could revisit this kind of question of the different audiences that talked to. I mean, the man Gandhi and his art, no? Like, because it made me aware that probably the staging of his own sacrificial life perhaps also addressed itself so well outside of the Marxist revolutionary movements to a white audience, but also to a colonial or still colonial public of the rest of the world, though in different ways, but addressed itself at the same time to his followers in India in an altogether different manner, so that there ought to be really a distinction between the, say, someone trained in a Christian or say be subjected as a Christian, and the way Christian cosmology functioned as a colonial and capitalist apparatus in high imperialism. Those people must have seen Gandhi completely different, and I think one can see it perfectly in all the mass cultural representations, of course, than his function was, and within India and within the decolonizing world at the time. And I think some part of it we see very strongly in the book, but at the same time, some of it seems to me almost foreclosed by the fact of its enclosure within a concept of art that can at the same time not really deal with the almost cosmological dimension of the anti-colonialism that is at question here. And I think that would loop back to what Monica has brought in terms of how this cosmological dimension kind of falls upon us now in a very real and planetary sense as a global immediacy of cosmological mediations in the sense of the climate crisis and in imminent ecological collapse. Do you have thoughts that you would like to share about this?
Well, this is, thank you so much for those thoughts. And actually, an earlier point you made about audiences, which is very important. I did not ask the question in the short book, who are the various audiences that each particular artist may have been addressing. Obviously, I assumed, and I could only do that, for the sake of making the argument that this is a gallery going public that the artist was producing the work for, though many of these works now circulate through the internet, as images that then become mobilized and used in different ways. But there is the question of the global audience as well, right? And only a few global artists have made it into the book. And it was a decision I had to make very consciously as stage one of this project, that I really had to begin in the place of Gandhi's birth and where he is the father of the nation, by beginning with the artists of India, and then maybe moving to, this is just why I'm very interested in the South African example that Tridip brought out, then moving to another very important stage of his work and life, which is South Africa, and then, elsewhere. Because I'm also fairly convinced as a historian and somebody who teaches about Gandhi in a US educational context, that Gandhi is actually at the moment valued more outside the world in the West than he is in India. So there is a very important project waiting to be done on the manner in which Gandhi has been transformed into this kind of global icon. And the role, therefore, of artists who enable that project, right, is hugely important, I think. There's much more to be said also about Christian art. In fact, when I began in these early stages of work I'm doing on the global, where I am seeing a lot of Gandhi is actually in religion, what we would call religious art, being produced in the West, in Europe, the UK, and the US by artists who consciously identify themselves as Christian and have cast Gandhi into this. There's an image which is fantastic from the Salt March where he, really merges into the figure of Jesus, right? Which would be appropriate because Gandhi thought of Jesus as the perfect satyagrahi and modeled himself in very many ways on him. So I have, David Morgan, who's my colleague here, has also done so much on Christian visual piety, is a very important interlocutor for me, for example, in this phase of the project where I'm looking at the global as well. But your thoughts have also given me some very interesting ideas about political theology, Christian iconology, all of which would be fascinating to, engage with as I move forward.
Monica and Tridip, before we maybe open to some questions, do you have comments that you want to share?
One very, two slightly unrelated things, but I think important in the way Sumathi's project is unfolding. One that the institutions which memorialize Gandhi, and I have been, I have been caretakers of at least one of them, for more years than I should have been. But they have a very uneasy relationship to art. None of these paintings or sculptures, except of a particular kind, find a place in them, even temporarily. They hold painting competitions for school children, which they routinely do, and the young ones come and they do these beautiful paintings. But none of the painters which figure in Sumathi's book have a place in any of these institutions, and there are many. And that's something that we need to this uneasy relationship and almost a denial of the fact that there is that entire culture out there which is looking at Gandhi very, very differently from the way he sought to be memorialized in the institutions. I think that's something that we need to think about. The other thing was that when we began the project of memorializing Gandhi, it was done with the kind of modernism that is stunning. I mean, two instances only, and both come from architecture. One is the entire competition about, that this is modern India's first architectural competition done by the Indian state, is to create what came to be called the Rajghat. This cremation place had to be memorialized, and Pandit Nehru invites a public competition, and what is finally selected is a young American trained Vinu Bhuta's work, which is stark, stunning, beautiful, and as modern as it could have been. At the same time, just around that, young Charles Correa comes back to India, and one of his most important buildings is actually in the Sabarmati ashram. And those who've seen it or seen photographs of it, it was an act of hubris to build right next to Radhai Kunj, and then to do it in such a way that they began a conversation which has been going on. But these are two fundamental acts of modernism with which we began, and where we've come with that process is something that is important, because at some point we began to have disillusionment with the trajectory that we had started, at least both in terms of art, but also in terms of architecture. So I just wanted to make these 2 points as a continuation of what some of the concerns that Sumathi has had.
Thank you. Monica, do you have thoughts that you would like to share?
Yeah, I don't know how we're placed for time, but
that's all right.
I was told we can actually go on to the maximum of 5:30. Yeah, I think we probably end up a little bit earlier, so we are not super pressed for time right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 2 comments on very different things. First, to come back to the to this question of controversial or potentially controversial. When you were in talking about the Dalit artists, I think there's a kind of figure which, genealogy, which is potentially controversial, though is still not discussed, is the sculpture by Ramkinkar Baij on the Shanti Niketan complex. And of course, R. Shiva Kumar, when asked, takes the position that it was not controversial there. And so in a sense, I'd see it as a potentially controversial image, but has not, been yet in the center of focus. That was just a sort of a brief aside. But I want to pick up on this aspect that Tridip just mentioned about the work that you have studied not finding its way. These sort of distinct worlds where Gandhi is memorialized, musealized, and how the gallery doesn't meet the public institution. And I think this is really a larger question about the kind of structures of the contemporary art world in India, which is a recent post liberalization world that is grown extremely fast, and it's grown in a way that it's also a kind of, it's still it's an important gatekeeping function there as to who has access to certain kinds of intellectual resources and knowledge about what makes a work of art and what you relate to. And I think it's these sealed art worlds which account for the fact not only that these works that you have studied don't make their way into public institutions. I think it's also one of the reasons why I wondered about this, when I think of the very wonderful work that exists on, say, Atul Dodia or Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, these, very important contemporary art, contemporary and modernist artists, and yet the works you discuss don't figure there at all. Why is it that art historians or art critics who engage with contemporary art also practice the same forms of selection unconsciously, which the contemporary art world is also doing, this shying away from themes that have some kind of association with more, so with other kinds of institutions, with different kinds of agendas. I really wondered, and especially this wonderful. I mean, you showed this stunning work of Sheikh with this map of Ahmedabad, or the Atul Dodia's work where he plays on Piero della Francesca's image of Christ, and it's just something that I've been thinking about, and I think these are structures which kind of replicate themselves. Just want to...
Perhaps we should open up to questions from our listeners.
Sure. Why don't I ask a few? I will ask the questions. I'm going to ask the questions. There are some comments, which if we have time, I will post them, but I'll ask the questions first. Sumathi, the first one is for you, and it makes a reference to a book which I've just looked up, and I will, and the book is Joseph Helfenstein and Joseph Newland's book, Experiments with Truth, Gandhi and Images of Nonviolence. So that's the reference, but that's not the question. The question is, can you speak to the thread of nonviolence which is there in that book and your choice of disobedience? Okay, if you can keep your answers straight, direct, and slightly brief, we can take more questions.
Yes, thank you. And I love that book, by the way. So whoever the person in the audience who posed the question, thank you. It's a wonderful book to look at. And it's a great question to ask because I deliberately did not go for the more obvious, right? Gandhi is the apostle of nonviolence angle, and it's not that I'm opposed to it or anything, but I was really more intrigued by what I see as Gandhi's real relevance to our times, which is the way in which he produces an enormous critique of industrial capitalist modernity. And nonviolence then becomes a part of that. And I had been intrigued for a long time because I teach about Gandhi in the West, in the US Academy. This is exactly how Gandhi is seen, right? He's been stereotyped, I would argue, as the apostle of nonviolence. And I have to, the very first thing I have to tell my students is that Gandhi was not a pacifist, that Gandhi's theories of nonviolence are hugely complicated, that under certain circumstances, in very specific ways, he even advocates violence. And it comes as a shock because of this enormous cult that has developed around Gandhi as an apostle of nonviolence. So I really also wanted to speak against that by bringing to the forefront what I see as a really radical potential of Gandhi's life and thought and practice for our times, which is the fact that he gets us to think about the violence actually of capitalist modernity. Right? So that is why I really decided to focus on disobedience, which of course includes his theories of ahimsa as well. Yeah.
Okay, connected to that, but from the same person, but this was in the context of when you were talking about nonviolence earlier and about Tridip's point about statues, etc. This is just a comment, you don't have to respond to it, is that there is a walking Gandhi statue in Irving, Texas, which serves as a witness to nonviolence in the form of a memorial park. So this was just a comment from.
You're muted.
Sorry, there are two fairly complicated questions that I'm going to try and unpick. But before that, can I ask another one, which is, and I'm going to read this out. Someone's just sent a message saying, why do you keep moving your head? I keep moving my head because I have to look at 3 screens, that's why. Can the extensive representation of Gandhi in art globally be seen as an implicit endorsement of his politics, and may therefore also explain, in the context of the conversation that was happening, the absence of someone like Bhagat Singh?
Mm-hmm.
Sumathi, that's for you, but I mean, the others can also respond.
Provisionally, I would say, of course, we need to do an analysis. I do not want to end up by making the cardinal mistake of flattening the global image of Gandhi, right? Because I'm still at such an early stage of thinking about it. But just if you begin even with the public statuary, so maybe since statues have figured quite a bit in the conversation so far, there is a kind of standard image, not least because of the role of the government of India. And Tridip is absolutely right. This is one of the ways in which Gandhi got exported out of India, right? A lot of statues can get sent out by the Indian government. Indian sculptors are commissioned to set up statues abroad and all of this, right? There is a particularly standard image of Gandhi, which confirms the global way in which people would like to see Gandhi as this kind of sanitized apostle of nonviolence, rather than the much more, his absolutely sharp critique of the industrial West is not something that is perhaps, well, how it would translate into the aesthetic realm would be fascinating, you know, to think about, but it's not something that is even, I think, understood that much in a broad sense in the West, right? So that would be one provisional response I would give. And I really don't know anything about the global presence of Bhagat Singh, if I would want to think about that. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Monica, did you want to say something?
No, not really, except that I think there's also this enormous asymmetry in the access to knowledge about these two figures. And I think we're very grateful to Kama MacLean for bringing out this aspect of Bhagat Singh, because there's also a canonical, conventional historiography which she was been questioning in her book about the two being, you know, kind of incommensurable poles. One excludes the other of a kind, you know, of a struggle for nation building. So I would just leave it at that.
Tridip, did you want to say something, or okay? Can I ask the next question? I'm going to say it in 3 parts and you'll realize why I'm saying it. The question is this: can Gandhi be described as a meta-aesthetician, not in the literal sense, but connected to his ontological and metaphysical stand? In that context, can he be called a meta-aesthetician?
I think Tridip should take a stab at this question, if I will, if I can say so. But one point I would like to make is I have begun through the course of this work to begin to really think about the ethics of care in Gandhi. I got fascinated much after I finished writing the book and with a wonderful painter who's I'm still trying to learn about, called Molly, with a series of really interesting sketches which I found in Vijay Kumar Agrawal's collection, where Gandhi is tending to it's a case of, if you remember, Gandhi had a really strong position on leprosy. And this wonderful scholar who got afflicted with the disease comes to Gandhi's ashram, and this lots of interesting things to say about that, but the care with which he tends to the leper's body, and then the care with which the artist renders it. So to the extent that we can think about aesthetics as a form of care, I think there is something really interesting to be said about Gandhi as, I don't know whether he's a aesthetician, if that's what I heard you say, but there's something there, I think, for us to think with. But it's a very provisional answer. But Tridip, I think, might have more to say about this.
Very briefly, two things. When Gandhi was asked something about art, he came up with a very enigmatic answer, and which was that Jesus is the supreme artist. So yes and no. So he doesn't think of himself or as somebody who's a meta aesthetician, but aesthetic considerations in the sense that they lead us to truth are very much part of Gandhi's self-volition. They're very much part of what Gandhi saw as a teleological movement towards which he needed to go. I tend to think that for him, the entire act of brahmacharya, not in terms of celibacy, but as an act or as a conduct that leads one to truth, is an aesthetic act. Because fundamentally what it requires is harmony of senses. It is when all the senses are harmonized that you could actually begin to think and practice that conduct which leads one to truth. So yes, there is a very conscious engagement with the world of aesthetic that happens there. What we've really not talked about, because this is something that is not a subject here, is another aspect of Gandhi, which is his relationship to literature, and particularly poetry. Now, if you actually were to think of Gandhi's relationship to poetry, which is deep, which is profound, his knowledge of poetry is astounding, and his ability to remember verses is of a stunning order. One would actually then be able to complicate and also provide a greater foundation to thinking about the question of aesthetic.
Monica, did you want to say something?
No, I think Tridip has given a superb answer. I have nothing to add to this.
Okay. Anselm, did you want to say anything to any of this?
Not directly, but I think perhaps it relates interestingly to this question that I think was opened up now through different vectors of the kind of valence and meaning that Gandhi's anti-modernism can have in a situation where we are kind of looking back, say, at the 20th century as defined by these two large and often intertwined, never neatly to be separated, but also not similar liberation attempts, that of the Soviet communist project and that of the anti-colonial movements, where it seems to me that the anti-modern at the moment is an extremely interesting and important, politically urgent, discursive kind of node in which a lot of reactionary politics, in the sense of the kind of almost that which already earlier Marxist art historians have even identified as the origin of modern art. I mean, to just make a side note to the emergence of the modern in the art, in the sense that it's romantic anti-capitalism. It's about mourning something that has been lost and it needs to be recuperated in the meta discourse of the aesthetic, a lost unity to be recuperated, etc., which is clearly so interesting in this kind of works because they are situated formally at a nexus where somehow that which they do formally is also mirrored, but perhaps in reverse, in their subject matter and inextricably linked to the political fate of both the modernist liberation project in terms of hyper-industrialization and the anti-modern insofar as it's a non-secular but not necessarily nationalist, insofar as nationalism is in itself a colonial formation and a modern bound to certain forms of capitalization that are not necessarily overcome with state socialism. So whether this anti-modern, whether we can recuperate a kind of emancipatory dimension from the anti-modernism of Gandhi seems to me a really urgent question that has been appearing on the horizon of this conversation that we've had so far.
Okay, thank you
the
very much.
Non-modern, right? I mean, Gandhi's position on all this, even though people have, for example, if you take up the question of technology, and in fact, there's a fantastic argument to be made the way artworks have looked at Gandhi and the questions of technology. And I gesture to it a little bit by looking at the works of Debanjan Roy in the book, right? I mean, Gandhi was famously dismissed as being a Luddite, but he was not that. He used technology, including the technology, going back to Monica's early comments of the spinning wheel. He really was against capitalist technology, right? A particular industrial scale technology, which would actually dehumanize the human being, right? So I would not say yes, there's a sense of anti-modernism, but I really think of him as at an angle to the modern is the way I have begun to think about him. And some scholars have argued he was a non-modern. Others have argued he was an alternate, modern. But I have come to think of him as somebody who has this kind of very sharp angle to what becomes the normative modern, very closely connected to capitalism, right?
May I say something just for a minute, please? It's interesting that Gandhi is, in terms of his understanding of material world and his engagement with material world, perhaps the most modern of Indians. He is perhaps the only one among the pantheon of Indian leaders who's able to overcome these deep-rooted cultural objection that we have of doing things with your hands. He is somebody who works with his hands. We forget that he worked on leather, he worked on wood, on architecture. He is the first sandal maker in that sense. He's the only sandal maker in the national leadership. He works with shit, he works with dead body, he works with cleaning, he works with the deceased body. So in that sense, he's an extremely non-conservative and in that sense, very contemporary modern person. We also forget that India's first design competition was launched by him in 1927. And it's not an act of accident that the National Institute of Design should come to Ahmedabad. There was something. So I think this relationship about or understanding about modernity also in terms of his practice needs to be thought of differently.
Yeah. Can I just to actually add to that is that it also depends on how we conceptualize the modern as not something which is a kind of, something which diffuses from a Western center and then you have it replicated in the rest of the world, but something which is, which is a kind of a transcultural process of new formations that emerge in different contexts so that you could actually, the agenda maybe today, especially when we look back at the 20th century, as you said, is to recuperate a more, ethical mode of the modern, maybe within this Gandhian context, which Tridip has just described, which is where I think it's something that's anti-alienation. There's a kind of wholesomeness in it. and I think this is something which is, it's not again, if you look at it from a non-Eurocentric point of view, it's not a project which has ended. So it's something that has a potential of continuing.
Just to remark, maybe just from the standpoint, from sort of the cultural positioning of myself, where of course this kind of imports of Indian cultural heritage and spirituality has informed the politics of German nation building and German modernity and the anti-modernism of the anti-modernity stance of modernism to a certain extent, and what has been called also in relation to fascism, reactionary modernism, is of course that the question of anti-alienation and the question of holism is in the political history of fascism a deeply problematic stance, and of course we can see parts of that same matrix playing out in the present, and not only in India. On the other hand, we know that somehow much like an anti-colonialism that is capable to living up to the challenge of the present needs exactly this dimension without it falling under the sway of the desires of nation states in the purpose of as sort of crafted as whatever essentialist mythology, or as a cover for certain forms of extractivism. So that seems to me the kind of note, at least from my own positioning in this, where this is so urgent and important, these questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes. I have 2 questions. One ties up, this is addressed to everyone, so if all of you can keep your comments brief, but it ties up with the point about vectors and valence that Anselm, you were making, even though the question actually came before you made the point. Does making Gandhi a hyper icon, that is visual simplification, reduction of the historical person, increase the potential for iconographic multivalency across time and place? Anyone can start.
So is the question whether simplification leads to proliferation? Is that what the question is getting us to think about?
Does making Gandhi a hyper icon, i.e. visual simplification, reduction of the historical person, and therefore making it a hyper icon, increase the potential for iconographic multivalency across time and place?
Well, if I can take it's a good question to think about, because on the one hand, there's a kind of standardization of the image of Gandhi, right? Which is what leads him to become this particular highly recognizable, almost logo-like figure who is, becomes, mobile everywhere, globally, actually, I would say. You don't even have to name him, he's known, right? And the repeating of that image, enables that. On the other hand, I think what led me into this project, and in the book, you only get a sliver of my enormous archive, is yes, there are lots of images which are just like each other, and there is this replication of the iconic. But what really stood out for me, especially in the hands of the most talented of artists, is creative ways in which to move away from the iconic, to produce alternative ways of looking at the same, right? Which is also what got me to write the book. So I think there is some really interesting dialogue between the hyper-iconization and the simplification, and then the complexity also that comes in, is the way I would respond to this question.
Is there a greater possibility of meaning making? Is there a greater possibility of meaning making through hyper-iconization?
Yes and no. I would say that some meanings get more dense, if I can call it that, because there are certain areas around which I have seen images coalesce, and some of these are the ones I have documented in the book. But Tridip, for example, brought up this fantastic example, which is critical to Gandhi in practice. Some would argue everything started with that, which is Gandhi and Brahmacharya, right? And I have puzzled over how and why that has not really translated itself into the visual realm. And it goes back to some fundamental question that Monica knows better than I would about why certain things get shown, can only be shown, certain things can only be said but not shown, and all of this. What gets into the representational realm, what never makes it into the representational realm. So yes, there are areas in which the work of art has actually deepened our understanding of what we have inherited from the textual or the verbal understanding of Gandhi. But there are areas which are still not represented in the work of the image, I would say, at the moment. But, it's an open field, right? So that is what is also exciting to think about.
Okay, Anselm, did you want to say anything briefly?
No, perhaps, I mean, at the end, towards the end of the book, you quote Gita Kapoor by saying that the Gandhi is India's abiding abstraction, which at that point of reading the book is, of course, somehow as sort of obvious as surprising at the same time, because it's a book full with figurations, of course, and many of the artists are not necessarily perceived first within the genre which they appear here. I was just wondering, maybe if these last three questions, if you wanted to maybe make a brief comment about this quote and how you what it does for you, like this image of the abiding abstraction.
Well, thank you. I was actually so focused on the abiding, and Gita Kapoor, by the way, is of course a scholar who I deeply respect, and of course all of her writings generally in the field of art, but also her many interesting observations about Gandhi are hugely important for me. But I really read abstraction, not so much in the way an art historian, even though she writes as an art critic, I really read abstraction as absorption and the abiding nature of that. The fact that, all roots seem to lie through Gandhi, that whatever we do, India has to go through Gandhi, but in that process, he also gets hollowed out and emptied out, right? Is the way I read that quote. But thank you for bringing that up, because it was and I deliberately placed it at the very end of the book rather than at the beginning, because it was one of my inspiring starting points for engaging with this project about, why is this figure who died 70 years ago? Yes, he may be the father of the nation. Why do we keep coming back to him again and again and again, right? And I think that sentence condensed it for me.
Okay, great. I have one last question, and we have 3 minutes. So Monica and Tridip, were you sort of screaming to say something in response that I'm stopping you from? Okay, so the last question is the next set after the whole question of aesthetics, and this is about ethics. So the question about ethics refers obviously to Gandhi's very famous quote, which is about "you shouldn't erect my statues in public places," and etc., etc. So the question is, the actual question is it ethically right to set up his statue anywhere? But the extension of that question is, what are your positions on the whole question of, the ethics of representation and the way in which we study it in history? If you can keep your answers brief, please. Monica, would you want to go first?
No.
Okay.
I think Sumathi should take this first.
Sumathi, do you want to go?
Oh my goodness, I was hoping Monica would take it first. I want to resort to one of my favorite theorists, Bruno Latour, because I would not, as somebody who loves the image, not necessarily only qua image, but the movement of the image. I do not want to be in the position of being an iconoclast and say, stop making images. I take pleasure in the proliferation of images and the cascading of images. The more meaningful they are, the more interesting they are, right? But the very act that the image is kept in movement is an ethical and a political and an aesthetic project for me, right? Yes, Gandhi may have been opposed to making statues, but I also think some of the works of art that, you know, are being produced today, Gandhi would have found them interesting and intriguing. So, and his position on art was ambivalent for sure, but he was also somebody, as Tridip pointed out, you know, presided over numerous art exhibitions of the Congress Party, right? So that's the way I would respond to that question.
Anyone else wants to say anything briefly about ethics? Yeah, Tridip, please do.
I think he would have been very disappointed with the way he's been painted, right? For the simple reason that all the images that we have, or the large amount of images that we have, is a toothless Gandhi. Toothless in more ways than one. The iconography really starts of the 55-year-old Gandhi, and nothing before that, as it were, seemed to matter, except that very, very beautiful statue of Tinker Christophers in Johannesburg. So I think he would have been disappointed with the way we've painted him or we've sculpted him. That's one. Second, I think he would have also been very disappointed in the way we've memorialized him, because for him, the real memorial would have been either action or deep thought that arises out of that action. And he would have felt that we failed, and in the sense, people like me who were caretakers of these institutions failed to really understand what a memorial ought to have been. So those two responses.
Monica, did you want to say something?
Well, just very briefly, yeah, of course, I was also going to say that, you know, we need to distinguish between monumentalization and exactly memorialization, as what Tridip said, and image making per se, which I will absolutely go along with Sumathi's position on it. And as somebody who spent so much of my life working with images, I see my work, you know, I think it's, you know, there's nothing ethical or unethical per se. Is, you know, it's the responsibility with which you work with your medium, and I think that is an ethical responsibility one has for the kind of knowledge about images that, you know, you are producing, and the years spent in a classroom. I think that for me is a profoundly ethical aspect. So I think I wouldn't even talk in terms of, you know, the image being ethical or unethical per se. Can I just bring in one particular point that came up earlier about this icons and proliferation? One aspect, just to add to all that has been said, is that today, with the digital proliferation of images, you know, the so-called icon develops a whole life of its own, and the proliferation of meanings which you can no longer control. So, you know, that's a logic that we also have to keep in mind when talking about iconization. Okay, that's all.
You have the last word, or would you like to finish your piece?
I don't have anything to add at this particular point. I'm chewing on many different points that have been made.
Thank you very much. Then it is now my very, very pleasant task to thank all of you. But before I do that, and for which I'm really very grateful, it has been a fantastic discussion. It's been exactly what I had wanted it would be. But I do want to say a couple of other things. One, Sumathi, is not to make you feel worse than you sounded when you mentioned it, but Jitish Kalat was going to be part of this discussion. But given the situation that is at present, I agreed that he would that it was fine. He's aware of today's discussion, and I will send him a link to the recording, and I will tell him that he was very fondly remembered. But I did want to do that. The other thing I did want to say was a formal thank you from the side of LSE South Asia Center to Roli Books for arranging to have a copy of the book sent to Anselm. It's very important our events rely on the goodwill and the enterprise of publishers so that we can have discussions like this. I hope they have found it useful, and they you know, it is an effort to sort of send something. It is now for me to only thank all of you for this fantastic discussion, from which once again I have myself learned so much. So a very, very formal word of gratitude to Anselm Franke, Monica Juneja, Sumathi Ramaswamy, and Tridip Suhrud. Thank you very much. And we will all have every good reason to reconvene in different circumstances again. Until then, goodbye.